In the second part of our event, we now want to focus more on the part of practical application. And we considered a number of areas and a number of fields that we could choose, and we had a multitude of riches, if you will, a real problem to make a choice. And we decided to focus on one field that comes to mind immediately, and that is the law, because of course the law is the foundation of our regulation. And if we want to talk about policy implementation and practice, the law is one of the areas that we have to address. And as a counterpoint to that, somebody from the arts. So I think that is a lovely combination today that will shed some, I think, interesting light on how we translate the ideas that we've explored in the morning into practice. And it is my great pleasure to introduce David Townend to us. He is based at the University of Maastricht, where he is a professor of law, but also, and for our context, very relevant, a professor of philosophy of law in the area of the life sciences, health and medicine. And he's a very distinguished scholar in these areas. He's written many things. I'm sure many of you know many of them on the interplay between the individual and collective responsibility, and how that can play out and indeed should play out in regulation. And so I'm very delighted to welcome him to the stage. Just a quick reminder, these are spotlights. They're not framed as the longer academic talks, but we asked our speakers to give a succinct short talk, and we will then have a short discussion afterwards. David, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you, Elena. Thank you very much. Super. Thanks ever so much, Elena, and Barbara for the invitation to this, the kick-off of this remarkable centre. It's such a privilege to be here and to have heard this morning's contributions. So, I'd like us to walk through some of the practical issues that... hello. About technology and lecturing. No, about... Currently, I'm sitting on a committee from BBMRI ERIC, although I'm not part of BBMRI ERIC, I've just been roped in to do this. And it concerns creating a code of conduct under Article 40 of the General Data Protection Regulation for a code of conduct for the health and life science sector. And it poses, I think, an enormous number of very interesting questions, because we are told continuously big data has marvellous opportunities for health and health research. And indeed, this is probably the case. Which makes it, is it a matter of public health? Is this a new shift in the way that we're thinking about the meaning of public health? Or is it, how far is it dependent on solidarity as well? Is this, in a way, an opportunity to realise solidarity? So how do we react? What can we operationalise through this opportunity in the GDPR? My backdrop, my starting point for a lot of this is to some extent, well, it's all presumption and nonsense, really, isn't it? Like all good political things. But it's sort of a backdrop of the decline of the trades union membership, in no small part in the UK, for example, because of the decimation of trades union law, and probably the decline of political party membership. I always ask my student audiences, how many of you are members of political parties? And they get the word party and then they realise that political party, no. So it's extraordinary, really, the collapse of that sort of participation. If we're looking for questions of how do we engage people, that's an interesting sort of one. mention has already been made of the elections and the referendums that we've had and the outcomes that we're beginning to see. One of the things I've looked at when I've been looking at public involvement, public engagement in these questions about the use of big data has come through the Eurobarometers and other public opinion surveys. The Eurobarometer is particularly interesting here because they begin to show perhaps that a large proportion think that this is all playing genetic information and the like, it's all playing God. Some believe that they have to have informed consent for these sorts of things. Others say, no, the pharmaceutical industry shouldn't be influencing the agenda here. And it's just a very strange thing. But what do we take from these public opinion surveys? I think what we take is that there are a range of opinions. And it's not usual for law to have to deal with a range to try and include as many as possible. We usually sort of go for the middle ground and then ignore the outsides. So this sort of question that comes, how do we include a lot of people who seem not to be engaged? And the first thing I would observe here is that there's probably a shift to autonomy in health law. Shift to autonomy in health law. And part of that is seen in this sort of, these are made-up statements, but they carry sentiments you hear a lot when you talk to people about this. You say, I want to be cured whenever I walk into the hospital, whatever's wrong with me. That's a sort of hope that we all have, I suppose, isn't it, really? But then at the other side, there are a lot of people within this range of opinions, that there's a range that some people would say, it's my data, I get to choose what happens to it, and I don't have to let you use it for research. And then there's another variation of that says, I pay for my healthcare in cash, requiring me to pay with my data in kind is not fair. Now, I'm not suggesting that this is widely held. This is at one end of a spectrum. But if we want to try and include people, if we want to try, for example, to end up including people in healthcare and not having them vote with their feet and leave healthcare because they're frightened of their data being used, then we have to try and accommodate them. We have to find a way of dealing with this. And at the same time, we see a shift in patient rights. We start with what we might describe as classical patient rights, where we'd probably find that in something like the Oviedo Convention of the Council of Europe, which is an expression of that early set of patient rights from, say, starting in the 1970s and the like, which is trying to articulate the doctor-patient relationship. It's trying to create an environment of, say, informed consent. It's embodying the fiduciary duty of care. That idea that the professional has a duty of care which puts the patient or the person, the beneficiary of the duty, puts them in first place, and the doctor's interests, the fiduciary's interests, are, well, in classical English trust law, nowhere, but certainly secondary. So we have this idea of the doctor-patient relationship. Now, is this a paternalistic relationship necessarily, or is it a professional relationship? I would tend to say it doesn't have to be a paternalistic relationship in the way it's run, but it's certainly a professional relationship, one might say. Now, emerging more recently, we have new patient rights, which you might look to see in the European Union's Cross-Border Patient Rights Directive, where the patient is seen much more as the consumer. Information changes there because it's not just informed consent for the particular procedure, it's information about where to get the care, how you're going to buy it, from whom are you going to buy it. It's much more a consumer choice, concerns purchase of health care. It also includes complaints about what happens when things go wrong. And it underpins this more atomized personal health regime, which in a European context is probably different from what we've been used to, although obviously in other parts of the world that's not new. What's the real driver here? Is it about liberating patients? That's a really difficult one, isn't it? Because a lot of it talks about cost. Spiralling costs of healthcare for the state. We have to do something about it. And you begin to wonder whether it's a real concern that I'm overweight or that I might cost people too much because I'm overweight. Oh, sorry, yes, that was real, wasn't it? Okay. So with this, where do we go with personal data? We go here. So, the GDPR, we've heard it spoken about already, the General Data Protection Regulation, talks about my data very much. It's putting the data subject in control, it talks about, and it's worried about the sorts of abuses that we have perhaps on the internet. And there's a rhetorical position that goes with it of the individual being placed in control of their personal data. And it's not just a rhetorical position, because when you start looking at the actual regulation itself, you do begin to see quite a lot of evidence of this. So if we talk about my data, control, internet abuse of data, we might look to Article 17, the right to be forgotten. Supposedly a new right. It's an interesting new right because it's in brackets after the right of erasure, which was what we had before. You might find me saying it's what we had before for quite a lot of the GDPR, but anyway, it's about, in Article 6.1e, a limited public interest basis for legal processing. It's slightly more limited than the directive was. It articulates what it doesn't actually tell us what the public interest is, but it does give some indication of who's going to be determining it, and that more member state stuff. If you look at Article 5, we see a reinforcement of this data subject's control in the language that it uses, the little labels after the rights. And the principles are very similar to what we had under the directive, but now we call them purpose limitation, data minimization, storage limitation. It's all very reductionist, and the idea is you don't have very much data. Well, that was the idea under the directive, actually, but we seem to be ramping that up under the regulation. And of course, the big thing that's woken up a lot of institutions is the fines, because they've hit that's big numbers now, 20 million, or large percentages of your turnover. So everybody's woken up to the idea that it might count for something now. What we have seen, though, interestingly, is under Article 4.11, the strengthening of consent. It tells us that consent of the data subject means any freely given, specific, informed, and unambiguous indication of the data subject's wishes by which he or she, by a statement or by a clear affirmative action, signifies agreement to the processing of personal data relating to him or her. Lovely, poetic, really, isn't it? But the thing to note here is this specific. Now, I don't think they mean specific as in it's specified as research. I think that would be, no, it's got to be very individual, specific to that piece of research, which is awkward. And it certainly awakens ideas of reconsenting, perishability of consent. You can't just have consent going on forever. That's certainly what we hear more and more at data protection conferences, and yes, there are data protection conferences, and they are as exciting as they sound. I'll come back to consent in a minute, but I have a feeling that layout, if you like, that set of ideas in the regulation is pushing us towards this individualism, this individual control. But we then have to ask, well, what's the extent of privacy? Because this privacy is where it all comes from. And this is where it becomes problematic to me, trying to work out where we're going in terms of this code of conduct. Because if we look at the privacy human rights, what we see immediately is that in the Universal Declaration, it says no one shall be subjected to arbitrary interference with his privacy. And the word arbitrary is interesting, isn't it? Because it's already telling us this isn't an absolute right. And that's reflected in the European Convention on Human Rights there, Article 8, where we're talking about there shall be no interference by a public authority with the exercise of the right except such as it accepts. So it's an idea that in the public interest we can act. So privacy is limited, and there is a sense of the public interest. Now, one thing that came up in the earlier discussion was what's the basis of harm. Privacy harm I find quite interesting. From my perspective, I thought I'd throw this in just for good measure. There seem to be two sorts of losses going on here, two sorts of breaches. One of them is negotiable, which would be a consequential loss. If your data is breached and somebody sees it and then acts upon that illegally, for example, an insurance company, an employer, the classic ones that people are worried about, then one might argue that this is something that can be compensated because it's a definable loss. The problem is that it also gives rise to what you could describe as a dignity breach. That somebody has seen my data who shouldn't have, and it doesn't matter about the consequences, that is sufficient. And one could argue that that is extraordinarily difficult to compensate because you can't get somebody to unsee something. And that's one of our first problems with privacy as a legal idea. I would also say privacy as a legal idea is difficult because it purports to be objective. But I bet if, there's a reason I've got a CCTV camera pictured there, because if we all went home after this wonderful event and found that the local authority had put up a CCTV camera outside our house, I would bet that there would be a range, well, no, given the centre of what we're doing today, there might be a range of views expressed, because I'm sure some will be like me and go, oh, they're going to be able to see what I'm doing. They shouldn't be doing. I can't stand the way that. I might even write to the Times. I'd be so annoyed. Others of you, if you'd been unlucky to be burgled, might say, oh, it's about time. This will protect my proprietary privacy. Others, if you'd been even more unlucky and mugged in the street, might say, well, that's protecting my physical privacy. And that's the sort of nod to Anita Allen's typology of privacy, which is really helpful. So I think that what we end up thinking is that actually privacy is a subjective idea, which I think of it as almost a barometer of how in tune with your society you feel. Which makes it really difficult I'm going to put this down because I don't think it's making any difference. So it feels really quite different. Two minutes. Oh, sorry. Makes a difference. Right, okay. So I think it's very subjective. And it's also, it depends on the relationship, so it's a constantly moving target for the law to try and define somebody's privacy. So I wonder if the public interest is a better bet. Because in the public interest, we might be taking a sort of utilitarian view, where we're saying, for the utility of the mass, we need to encroach on your privacy. Or we might take a Rawlsian view with that sort of idea of reasonableness. Then you'd have to say, well, all right, I don't like the idea that you're going to be able to do this for my privacy, but I can see that it's reasonable and I have to accept that in a sort of veil of ignorance type of position. We might even be able to argue from a Kantian perspective that the claim of your privacy right isn't that sort of almost Cartesian right at the heart of Kant. It's more, if you take a sort of Gowerthian approach, a secondary right to well-being and the like that supports your primary rights And therefore, I would argue you'd have to apply those rights, you'd have to claim those rights within the categorical imperative. So you couldn't claim your privacy instrumentalizing somebody else. So we can construct, through all sorts of different arguments, a sound public interest that isn't just letting the judge do whatever they want in the circumstances. But then I'm reminded of what Arendt says about dehumanization. Because if you're separating body and legal self, then all sorts of tyranny follows. And I can't help but think that some of the objection to people not wanting a public interest argument is actually an expression of this sort of argument, that it is dehumanizing the individual. We forget that this is humans, and we just feel that we can do what we want with their data. And that's reflected in some of the public expressions where they're talking about a sense of moving towards being a commodity for medical industry, shifting them from primarily being a beneficiary to being a commodity of, say, the pharmaceutical industry. Some work that two colleagues of mine from Sheffield, former colleagues, Mark and Natasha Taylor, Mark Taylor and Natasha Taylor, did some work, and they found that people weren't really after control. They were just wanting to be asked. It was almost good manners. And we'll come back to good manners at the end. So that's a sort of argument that says, well, public interest wouldn't really be a very good way of dealing with all of this, even though it would be a massively convenient and useful argument. So where might we go? I think under the GDPR there are opportunities. If we start with the premise that it's not really my data, it's data that relate to me, and that there's a significant difference there, because, yes, I know that we did have this comment earlier on about it's not really the Lockean deserts theory that should be in play, but to some extent it is, that researchers have done work on this, and even doctors have. Is it the patient's data, or is it data about the patient that the training of the doctor has enabled them to discern? So where might we go? Well, the GDPR tells us about the reasonable likelihood, or if we're talking about re-identification, it allows for reasonable likelihood of re-identification, rather than just saying any possibility. So if you're doing a lot of big data work, we have to look and say, well, what's the reasonable possibility, the reasonable likelihood? And we could limit that by data science itself. If we look at Recital 33, Recital 33 acknowledges that that business I was talking about with specific consent could actually end up being a broad consent. Because to do scientific research on big data, we need to have a broad consent rather than a very individual, constant returning to people. If you're running a biobank, that doesn't really work. So broad consent's allowed, although it's only under a recital. So there's a lovely argument to be. There's money for lawyers to make here on working out where a recital is in all of this. It is a limited public interest basis, so there is a limit on that public interest already there. But I think the most exciting thing that the GDPR has done is to clarify the idea of processing for further purposes. And if they are compatible with the initial purpose for which you process the data, then it carries on under the same legal basis. So you don't have to go back and, say, get new consent if it's compatible with. And there's a presumption that scientific research is a compatible purpose with other things. It's a rebuttable presumption, obviously, but it's a presumption in there. So the GDPR can be dressed up as it's all about data subject control and individual, but it can also be seen to be opening up for research. And so it's a question of how do we balance between those two positions? Because you could imagine a legitimate big data reuse of personal data that went something like this. You gain the data the primary way with informed consent, with a detailed informed consent. And then the secondary processing, the question is this compatible with the first processing? And if it is, and the presumption is that research would be, so you have to disprove that or rebut that, then you can go ahead. You'd have to notify the data subjects, if that was possible, that this was going to happen, but it's still a possibility. And if you can't claim that or can't show that it's compatible, then it becomes a new processing, so you're not reliant on the first legal basis for the processing. You can find a new legal basis for the processing. So as a conundrum for Article 40 lovers trying to write a code of conduct, we could go either way, which is always great, isn't it? That's how you end up with it. So, it had to be, didn't it? Sorry. There were so many candidates we could have used. But the GDPR has a rhetoric of individualism. That's what its purpose is. And it sort of tunes into another of those views on the spectrum that seems to be, when I have a choice, it's an absolute choice regardless. I should have put is it, but Well, is it? If I have choice, is it? And this seems to be something that has emerged in a more neoliberal sort of rhetoric since perhaps the 1980s. But when you look at liberalism before that, some old friends have said this is quite different. So John Locke says that, yes, there's a right to private property on the basis of the deserts labour model, but only so far as there's enough left for others. Adam Smith, who we heard so much about so eloquently before in The Wealth of Nations, prior to The Wealth of Nations, the book is The Theory of Moral Sentiments. And you can argue that that's the moral platform upon which he builds. Kant is talking about not instrumentalizing the categorical imperative, treat people as ends, not merely as means to ends. Mill, his liberty ends when you start harming others. Oh, right, got it right, good. I've had to put Kropotkin in because he's got a more ridiculous beard. But we've heard about mutual aid, and that seems to be a really important thing. So liberalism doesn't have to be framed in this more modern version. But that's theory. How do you put that into some sort of practice? Well, it wouldn't have been a solidarity talk, would it, without John Donne? No man is an island entire of itself. This sense of, seems to have a sentiment of solidarity. Now I was thinking, well, surely someone like Beveridge is going to have a strong sentiment towards solidarity, but the best I could come up with, the state in organising security should not stifle incentive, opportunity, responsibility in establishing a national minimum. It should leave room and encouragement for voluntary action by each individual to provide more than the minimum for himself and his family. Now, having listened this morning, my position on solidarity has had to change, hasn't it? Because that's probably within a definition of solidarity, isn't it? Especially if you've written the whole of the social security system before that for everybody. So, but then we get the next move might be to Margaret Thatcher in a keynote speech to the Woman's Own. She said, "I think we have gone through a period when too many children and people," interesting distinction, "have been given to understand, I have a problem, it's the government's job to cope with it. And so they are casting their problems upon society." And who is society? There are individual men and women and there are families, and no government can do anything except through people, and people look to themselves first. It is our duty to look after ourselves and then after our neighbour. It's already interesting as well. And people have got the entitlements too much in mind without the obligations. And then later she says, there is no such thing as society. That's perhaps gone a little bit far. So in the Netherlands, well, dear King Willem-Alexander, in his first King's Speech, talked a lot about the Dutch society fostering solidarity. And he says, it is an undeniable reality that in today's network and information society, people are both more assertive and more independent than in the past. This, combined with the need to reduce the budget, means that the classical welfare state is slowly but surely evolving into a participation society. Oh, that sounds good, doesn't it? Everyone who is able will be asked to take responsibility for their own lives and immediate surroundings. When people shape their own futures, they add value not only to their own lives, but to society as a whole. In today's world, people want to be able to make their own choices, manage their own lives, and take care of one another. It's the bit at the end that it doesn't quite... It's sticking, isn't it, a bit? Yeah. Well, of course, it's what the government's saying. But then, so what do I think law might do here? Well, if we thought of classical patient rights as version 1 and new patient rights as 2.0, I wonder if the next set of patient rights will be solidarity patient rights, because essentially patient rights have always been there to fill a gap. And I wonder if the gap that will emerge is around solidarity. We'll be focusing on similarity, not othering, as Barbara said, mutual necessity, revisiting, I think, fiduciary professionalism, using patient rights to ensure infrastructures for all, access, if you like. But I'd also say it might end up reframing human rights from a private property and labour value of individuality to dignity for simply being, which I think we might well have lost sight of in terms of human rights. But then the thing that really puzzles me is, what can the law do? And it sounds all very nice, but how on earth do we operationalise it? And I'm drawn back to 1711 and Shaftesbury's theory of politeness and Addison and Steele's ideas in The Tatler and The Spectator. Politeness was about other-centricity. It was all about polishing through discourse. It was about the coffee houses and trying to form a new society. It was practical. It was restorative. It was 1711 was the end of England had seen 3 civil wars and a bloodless coup. Things had got a bit out of hand, one might say. It was about restoring trust. And it did work. It's not just pie in the sky. Because ultimately the question is, who has the authority to bind others? And perhaps the idea for solidarity that the Lord needs to take is, we have the authority. Thanks very much.